Hello and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green. And this lecture is going to be used in various different courses and modules that the center produces, but its most immediate development is in a course called Homer and the Critique of Western Civilization. So there will be a little bit of particular attention to the study of the classics, as it's termed in the humanities, and particularly Homer. But of course, the discussion is much broader and it ties into public discourse on race and racism, particularly the enduring notion of Western civilization as it's been used rhetorically by white supremacists in our current culture. So let me just jump in here. I'll go to various different trajectories, both in the broad history of Western civilization, but also in the more particular academic discourse around race and racism, to hopefully make some sense of a very contentious discourse that is consuming national culture in the United States, where I live currently. So the lecture's title is Racism and the Rhetoric of Western Civilization. In this lecture, I want to address some of the contemporary concerns driving our course, Homer and the Critique of Western Civilization, or perhaps another course that this lecture might get inserted into or referred to, since what I have to say expands more than just the one particular course. The central tension in current critique or critiques of Western civilization surrounds the issue of racism and the rhetorical appeals made to the idea of Western civilization as a code for contemporary white supremacy. In February of 2021, the New York Times, for example, featured a story about Donel Padilla Peralta, a classics professor at Princeton University and longtime critic of embedded white supremacy within the field of classics or classical studies. Quote, Padilla believes that classics is so entangled with white supremacy as to be inseparable from it, says the New York Times. Far from being extrinsic to the study of Greco-Roman antiquity, he has written, the production of whiteness turns on closer examination to reside in the very marrow of the classics, or marrows of the classics, rather. So this article is just one of many, and it spawned a conservative response denouncing Padilla in the New Criterion, which claimed that the New York Times' framing of Padilla as a leader in the field of classical studies, or classics, was not true, and that his memoir about growing up in the Caribbean was, quote, whiny and, quote, self-indulgent. Other conservative critics have suggested that Padilla only got his job at Princeton because he was black, and therefore somehow shouldn't look the gift horse in the mouth. I assume that he shouldn't be too much of a critic, since it's his blackness that somehow got him the position, the academic position that he has, which of course has some embedded racism, I think, in that assumption. Other conservative critics have critiqued Padilla, so it's broader than just this critique of in the New Criterion, but the New Criterion reports, quote, Martin Luther King Jr. taught that what matters is not the color of your skin, but the content of your character. Padilla joins with the Black Lives Matter crowd in reversing that dictum. He is, as we put it in 2019, a, quote, apostle of all race all the time. So outside of the New Criterion, the Wall Street Journal recently ran an article reporting on various tweets of educators titled Even Homer Gets Mobbed. So that was released in late 2020. Such perspectives attack what they see as leftist wokeism among academics. These exchanges are indeed partly a microcosmic reflection of a larger social tension in public discourse in the United States. But here today, I want to suggest that in order to really understand the discursive tension, we need to go back further than the explosion of discourse around the hashtag Black Lives Matter that's arisen during the past decade or so. By doing so, I hope in this lecture to show that what's at stake in reading Homer's Odyssey or the classics or the critiques of the rhetoric that embraces Western civilization are anything but trivial, but also anything but elitist whining. So in order to do this, I need to go back a little bit further than the present conflicts arising in familiar discourse such as Black Lives Matter. So during the later half of the 20th century, one of the most well-known scholars of Black life in antiquity was Frank Snowden at Howard University, which is a historically Black university, right, or HBC. Over two books, Blacks in Antiquity, which came out in 1970, and Before the Color Prejudice, 1983, Snowden convincingly argued that before around 1500, or the advent of what scholars have termed the modern period, racism based on skin color did not exist. So in the 1990s, following the arrival of critical race theory, or CRT, which some scholars described Snowden's work as being at odds with this new discourse of critical race theory, which posits that racism is a constant feature of human society. So I know that in broader U.S. discourse, the attention that critical race theory has received in very right-wing inspired laws takes a very superficial and sometimes completely uneducated understanding to what critical race theory is. I might have time in other situations to dive deeply into just a discussion on what critical race theory is, but at least at the outset here, what I'm going to say basically, critical race theory advances the idea that racism is endemic and embedded within social inequality. And therefore, it offers itself as a kind of corrective to the progressivist notion that we are getting better over time with respect to race and racism. And so if you think about this in terms of practical work like activism, what you'll notice is that a lot of people who are committed to social justice get really, really committed when they're in school, and then they want to become teachers or they become social workers. And they go in thinking, I'm going to make a change, right? I'm going to make a difference in the world. And then after about 5 years worth of working in the field, they see that it's much bigger in terms of an issue than they as individuals can handle, and they burn out because they don't see the effect of their own individual efforts at changing a very large systemic kind of inequity that persists over time. So critical race theory offered itself as a kind of way of saying, like, look, this is something that is deeply situated in our society, and it isn't necessarily something that can just be handled say in the 1960s civil rights legislation, which, well-intentioned, didn't get us to the level of social equality that we might have wanted to have seen happen. So in some ways, some scholars, as we'll see with Dipesh Dsouza, for example, in an article that he wrote in the American Scholar in 1995, characterizes critical race theory as coming out of a kind of pessimism that happens in the 1980s and 1990s, where there's a reflection back on the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And there's this pessimism that arises because the social gains that were supposed to have happened in the civil rights era were not bearing any kind of fruit. And so reviewing Snowden's work, so Frank Snowden again, in the article for American Scholar, Dsouza follows in a way Snowden in asserting that racism arose as a theory of Western civilizational superiority. But he says that he's critical of this new discourse in the 80s and 90s called critical race theory for saying that racism is so embedded in society that it always exists. So instead, what Dsouza says is, no, look at Frank Snowden, and he says that racism emerged as this discourse that happens between the years roughly 1500 and the present. And therefore, because racism is a historical category, Dsouza says we can get rid of it because it was historical to begin with, and so wants to reassert a kind of progressivist rhetoric around discourse on racism as an antidote to what he sees as the pessimism of critical race theory. This is all happening in the 1990s, right? So this is well before the current explosion in discourse and the right wing's bashing of critical race theory, which we will get to later on. So in reviewing Frank Snowden's work, this is Dsouza sort of summarizing what Frank Snowden had said. So Snowden argues, according to Dsouza, that despite awareness of color differences in the ancient world, differences that were acknowledged and discussed in frank and sometimes pungent fashion, neither the ancient Greek nor the early Christians espoused anything resembling a theory of racial superiority. So this is not to say that there were no forms of discrimination in ancient society. For example, Dsouza notes that, quote, although there's little doubt of their religious and cultural ethnocentrism, the Arabs and the Chinese seem not to have developed a systematic ideology of racism. What the Arab and Chinese encounter with Africa illustrates is the acute civilizational arrogance that goes with relative political, economic, military, and technological superiority. All cultures, according to Dsouza here, all cultures are ethnocentric and begin with notions of supremacy, but powerful cultures that encounter simpler and weaker societies are strengthened in their convictions of superiority. When such arrogance is given a biological foundation, then racism is the result. End quote. Over my years as a teacher, so I'm just talking from my perspective here, when dealing with the subject of racism, I encounter in students of all backgrounds, whether white or black or Latinx, for example, I encounter regularly the tendency to want to distance, among students, to want to distance themselves from the issue of racism through one form of abstraction or another. The rhetorical motivation behind the abstraction is most frequently a kind of exceptionalism, I will call it, that first locates the individual person, so as a white man, as a white woman, as a blah, blah, something, right? So locating the individual person and then surrounding that individual person with some sort of characteristic that accepts them from the current discourse. So to take a really easy example of this, like it might be a white student who says something like, well, I'm white, but my family never owned slaves. Or conventionally speaking, like, I have a lot of friends of people of color. Or I identify my white privilege, right? And that there's something rhetorically going on that by acknowledging that, that it somehow puts one into a particularly different category. So I'm not saying it's wrong to acknowledge one's white privilege. I think it's actually a good thing to do. But what I notice in discourse around race and racism, especially when it's institutionalized in schools, for example, is that people are making a rhetorical move. They are positioning themselves as for an audience. And of course, I'm doing that right now, right, as I'm making a lecture that's for public consumption. And so within that, there's a positioning oneself in terms of how a broader public might judge someone. And so people are looking for ways to situate themselves that then allows them to sort of sidestep the historical situation with ongoing racism, for example. And so I call this rhetoric exceptionalist rhetoric. Well, this may have happened, but we are getting better over time. So progressivist rhetoric is something that most of my students who come to university have. So they might say, yeah, we're still dealing with issues of racism, and Black Lives Matter is an important movement, but overall, we've gotten better than that we were in the past. And that kind of thinking leads to a kind of status quo mentality that says, like, yeah, because society is progressing and getting better, I don't have to do anything individually on my part other than to acknowledge something. And then more progressivist rhetoric might be like, well, because I acknowledge my white privilege and my positioning, that puts me into a different situation and allows me to sort of be more active in addressing ongoing racism in our society. The point here is that what discourse tends to often do is be motivated by a way to sort of remove one's individualism or one's individual perspective from the broader social context in which ongoing racism or something like white supremacy occurs. And it makes sense, right? Like, who really wants to be like not a lot of people, I would say, want to be located or to locate themselves as overt white supremacists. Maybe some do, and that rhetoric definitely is something we will address, but most people don't want to be put into the category of saying that they're racist for some reason, right? They want to look for reasons to why they aren't. So the rhetorical motivation behind the abstraction, this tendency towards abstract, is frequently a kind of exceptionalism that first, as I say, locates itself in the individual and then surrounds the individual with a characteristic that removes them from the situation. It happens definitely more with people who have this thing that we called white privilege, because it says, well, I have this, but I'm different because this. Whereas maybe an African American person doesn't get to choose one's way out of their situation. For example, if they are being pulled over by the police in greater numbers, right? Just because racial profiling says that statistically speaking, somebody who has darker skin might somehow be involved with some sort of criminal activity, right? So this is definitely part of embedded racism, but also that is backed up by some sort of like demographic statistics that makes police over time treat people of a different skin color than white as being more prone to criminal behavior. And then of course that makes its way into popular media as well. So the tendency, which I'm going to clarify over many lectures, just one lecture isn't going to do it if we're going to talk about something like white privilege or racism. But I am going to locate that tendency in a deeper cultural situation. I'm going to say that it's itself a reflection of a political and economic liberalism that situates a right-bearing individual as the political and rhetorical entity in question. So what does this mean? It means that it's so. My use of the term liberalism here is not at all the same thing as what people in popular media discourse might call a liberal as opposed to a conservative. So I'm not exactly working on that kind of left-right political binary or that kind of a metaphor. It's rather a term designating how much of our current legal system and our legal and political economy frame the human goings-on of the world in terms of rights. So rights are something that individuals have. Liberalism is more of an economic term. Both conservatives and liberals in popular discourse would be subjects within a liberal economic situation, right? Based on political liberalism. So to say that one person has rights, especially something like inalienable rights, is a function of what scholars call modernity. And modernity here is not like the latest iPhone update. We're talking about that period from about 1500 to the present. During that period, a social ordering developed. And yeah, we could trace it back earlier to, say, the late medieval era. And in this development, there is a looking back at the failures of Greco-Roman civilization. And also during that gaze backwards. And what I'm saying is that people in the late medieval era and in the early in the centuries leading up to the 1500s or so, that there were many people that were already looking back to antiquity, and they were looking to antiquity to find ways to answer the social situations that they found themselves in what we call now the Renaissance, right? So the Renaissance, the term means just rebirth. And there is in European culture a kind of rebirth of interest and knowledge surrounding the ancient world that arises after the fallout of not only the Roman Empire but massive catastrophes such as the Black Plague in 1348 to 52, for example. And there are various versions of plagues that happen. In the late medieval era, there is an impulse towards what was at the time referred to as natural rights and natural law. It's very religious and particularly Christian-laden discourse that precedes what we might call the humanism that develops in the Renaissance. So modern Western culture individuates people and entities according to a notion of individuality that's underwritten by this thing called liberalism. Every rights-bearing individual has something in common, has something in governmental or legal apparatuses to identify it. We could go back to something like habeas corpus, right, or the concept of habeas corpus as it arises in the 13th century in English law, for example, right? And the idea of who has the body, right? The idea that the state shouldn't be able to, or kings shouldn't be able to just hold somebody and take somebody's body out of the public sphere and imprison it without some sort of reason for doing so and without saying where the body is, right? So habeas corpus is foundational, right, to these innovations in what becomes liberalism, right, which becomes this society that's based on individuals who are rights bearing or capable of having rights. So we can also think of it a little bit more tangibly, perhaps for us, in terms of the idea of something like a social security number, an identification card, even a POW or prisoner number. The great historian and philosopher Michel Foucault saw this shift in modernity as developing out of a disciplinary society, as he called it, where institutions were developed to make more efficient the flows of governing power. Foucault even developed terminology such as knowledge power and biopolitics to name the processes by which modern society subjectivates and individuates people. So there's something about the shift towards modernity that is always about an emphasis on the individual. Think about it in terms of like a famous statement from 1641 by René Descartes, the philosopher. I think, therefore I am. When we look back on that historically, we know it was not it was not a rejection of theology at all. It was actually made in a broader sort of defense of theological positioning. But what got termed in philosophy modern skepticism was to say that I'm not going to base my knowledge of my own existence on this kind of claim that something like a God created me. Rather, I know that I exist because I'm a thinking and reflective person that can ponder my own existence, right? That's where this sort of skeptical turn comes in. So when we look back on that, from the 21st century, we see there's a locating of authority in the individual, in the I that can recognize myself as a thinking being. That is characteristic of this turn towards modernity that happens in European or so-called Western discourse. So it should go without saying that, of course, historically, certain groups' rights were recognized and privileged above others, right? Eurocentrism, we know this sort of thing happened. In human rights discourse, for example, we can see a broadly, over the past 500 years or so, a shift in rights-based discourse since the late medieval thinkers who focused on the negative freedoms or freedom from. So think about that idea of habeas corpus, of who has the body. That is a notion of liberalism that is a freedom from the tyranny of a monarchical or governing power that would incarcerate me without just cause, right? So there's an obligation that the people in power have to say what they've done with a person when they've imprisoned it, the body, and where that body is, right? So that's a freedom from tyranny. Over time, what human rights scholars have seen is that in the late medieval era, there was this focus on negative freedoms or freedom from, to more recent thought since the late 18th century, since the development of like the Bill of Rights in American discourse, which emphasizes positive freedom or freedom to do something, right? So in very current discourse, like access to healthcare, for example, right? Access to an education, for example. These are positive notions of freedom. It's not positive and negative like good and bad or thumbs up, thumbs down. It's that early liberalism is characterized by a freedom from something and the right to be told why you're being incarcerated, to the right to some sort of access or privilege. David Sidorsky writes, and for example, he's a scholar of human rights, says, the inclusion of a number of human rights that relate to social and economic development is a point of difference between classic theory of natural rights and the theory that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, right? That inclusion, he says, and the priority to be assigned to social and economic rights has become the single most contested item in discussions of contemporary theories of human rights. Now, generally speaking, and I've maybe already turned off some of my listeners here, generally speaking, nationalized activist perspectives, especially in the United States around racism, see the tendency to pivot towards universal human rights as a discursive move away from the recognition of ongoing inequities that people of color, in their terminology, face. So this is a kind of legal or rights-based version of, quote, all lives matter or blue lives matter rhetoric. Now, the rhetoric of something like all lives matter, when it's made into a reaction statement to something like Black Lives Matter, is, of course, a red herring, a logical fallacy, right? That intentionally seeks to change the conversation itself and thus sidestep dealing with the actual concerns of activists who might say something like Black Lives Matter, right? So it changes, like as a reactionary statement, the sentiment of, or the statement of all lives matter, sidesteps the fact that people who say something like Black Lives Matter are attending to the ways that society has historically treated Black people's lives as if it doesn't matter, right? What's at stake here then is the possibility of affecting localized change in the day-to-day living of people who have been historically marginalized and considered less capable of achieving the status of, quote, full humanity in the political and legal institutions of this entity known as the West. So to return to Dsouza's summary of Frank Snowden in the late 20th century, quote, between the 15th century and the 19th centuries, the West made a swift and irreversible transition from a traditional society to a modern society. Enlightenment would help to produce Western success and also Western racism, according to Dsouza. Dsouza writes that the emergent biological notions of race based on skin color developed when the traditional assumptions about skin tone being reflective of respective environmental conditions no longer held. So what do we mean here? Well, for example, English Northerners were thought to have paler skin than Africans, for example, because Africans lived closer to the equator and the hotter climate had sunburnt their skin. This is an older way that people thought about how skin color differences worked. But the skin color in the pre-modern world was not by itself any kind of indicator of moral or intellectual superiority. So to take one example, we might look at the Venerable Bede, or Bede. He's this English Christian monk who lived from the years 673 to 735 and wrote this famous ecclesiastical history of England. Reporting in the ecclesiastical history that the Venerable Bede says is characterizing excuse my computer here, is reporting on the monk who later became Pope Gregory the First, but just as a monk, he initiated the first missionary conquest in England around the year 590 current era. So this is a quotation from the Venerable Bede. Bede says, "It is reported that some merchants, having just arrived at Rome on a certain day, exposed many things for sale in the slave boys' marketplace, and abundance of people resorted thither from England by." So Gregory himself went with the rest, and among other things, some boys were set to sale, their bodies white, their countenances beautiful, and their hair very fine. Having viewed them, he asked, as is said, from what country or nation they were brought, and was told, from the island of Britain, whose inhabitants were of such personal appearance. He again inquired whether these islanders were Christians or still involved in the errors of paganism, and was informed that they were pagans. Then, fetching a deep sigh from the bottom of his heart, he said, "Alas, what a pity that the author of darkness is possessed of men of such fair countenances, and that being remarkable for such graceful outward appearance, their minds should be void of inward grace." He therefore again asked what the name of the nation was, and was answered that they were called Angles. "Right," said Gregory, "for they in Latin have angelic faces, and it becomes such to be co-heirs with the angels in heaven." So he's making a wordplay on the angles and angels, right? Then he proceeded, "What is the name angels, Angeli, of the province from which they are brought?" It was replied that the natives of that province were called Dari. "Truly, de ira," he said, "withdrawn from wrath and called to the mercy of Christ." "How is the king of that province called?" he asked. They told him his name was Aiella, and he, Gregory again, alluding to the name, said, Alleluia, the praise of God the Creator must be sung in those parts. Then, repairing to the bishop of Roman Apostolic See, for he was not himself then the Pope, Gregory wasn't Pope yet, he entreated him to send some ministers of the word into Britain and to the nation of the English, by whom it might be converted to Christ. So as Pope, Gregory returned to his missionary interests in England with more authoritative force. Clearly, what we see here, though, is the recognition of skin tone. They see that there's a skin color difference, but a separate light and dark metaphor being employed with respect to one's religious conditions. So returning to Dsouza's article and Snowden's argument, they say, quote, "Racism developed when the environmental explanation was found by many Europeans to be untenable." As Winthrop Jordan documents in his classic study White Over Black, neither skin color nor lack of scientific and intellectual achievement could be plausibly blamed on the soil or the sun itself. Thus, atmospheric theories of race fell into disrepute in the late medieval, early modern period that produces the Renaissance. Overwhelmingly, then, we see that awareness of the continents of the Western Hemisphere radically challenged European conceptions of the world and its history. Racial environmentalism simply could not hold, and so another form of rationalization for the subjugation of other people or different peoples arose among the Europeans, largely based on the emergent discursive apparatuses of scientific knowledge that Europeans could wield against indigenous peoples of African and Western continents. So that said, we need to look back at the late medieval period, we definitely see the emergence of this thing called hermeneutic blackness arising from the late medieval period against a notion of whiteness as somehow spiritually pure. So that metaphor of blackness being dark or impure and whiteness being pure is already in existence in the late medieval period. We saw it with Pope Gregory already, right? but it was not yet mapped onto skin color as happens in the later early modern period. So the Fourth Lateran Council, this is another thing to look at, in the year 1215 decreed, quote, that Jews and Saracens of both sexes in every Christian province and at all times shall be marked off in the eyes of the public from other people through the character of their dress. The broad term Saracen in this context covered wide ranges of skin color. Saracen, writes Geraldine Hang, quote, can be understood to look like the variety of the world's peoples. Anti-black imagery became commonplace during the 12th and 13th centuries as tormentors of Christ were depicted in art increasingly with dark skin. Only over time did hermeneutic blackness become associated with physiognomic blackness, though. Importantly, however, there is no way to historically separate out this emergent form of physiognomic black racism from religious attitudes of the time, which themselves cannot be separated from a distinctive notion of politics during the period. So, resonating with this history, one contemporary Christian scholar, for example, a Christian theologian named Willie James Jennings, identifies this as what he calls the Christian imagination. And his book is called The Christian Imagination that I'm drawing on here. So Jennings calls the Christian imagination an operation informing the outset of the the African slave trade during the 1430s, with a theological justification for Euro-Christian superiority and emergent notions of civilization that built on a modern nostalgia for the Roman Empire. So with respect to the next 500 years, 1500 to the year 2000, Jennings says, quote, Christianity will assimilate this pattern of displacement. Not just slave bodies, but displaced slave bodies will come to represent a natural state. From this position, they will be relocated into Christian identity. The backdrop of their existence will be, from this moment on, the market, right? What he means is the market, the slave market, of course, but also the developing markets that we now call capitalism, right? So Jennings particularly describes this Euro-Christian attitude as central to the constructions of modern notions of race that inform inequitable treatment of Black and Indigenous peoples as well. One counterintuitive point that needs to be made here is, and that needs elaboration, is that the historical record only begins to see the notion of whiteness as a legal and socially organizing principle with the colonization of the so-called New World. So as the historian of whiteness David Reutiger writes in a book called The Wages of Whiteness, the term white arose as a designation for European explorers, traders, and settlers who came into contact with Africans and indigenous people of the Americas. As such, it appeared even before permanent British settlement in North America. Its early usages in America, however, served as much to distinguish European settlers from Native Americans as to distinguish Africans from Europeans. Thus, the prehistory of the white worker begins in the settlers' images of the Native Americans. Theodore Allen's richly sourced 2-volume study, The Invention of the White Race, notes clear parallels for social control adopted in the English colonization of Ireland and the emergence of the first slave laws in New England. Colonization during this period was always inherently Christian colonization. European scientific thought, no matter how unscientific by today's standards, set up a hierarchical taxonomy of, quote, rationality, which they used to justify the enslavement and genocide of other peoples. That is where modern racism comes from. In this sense, one cannot divorce modern physiognomic notions of race from the political theological impulses that sought to spread Christendom, or what I've called and written about elsewhere as Euro-Christian domination, and this impulse to dominate the rest of the world by European Christians. So I will then often use the term in this lecture and in other lectures, a term Euro-Christian, all one word, all lowercase, interchangeably with the idea of capital W, white, since whiteness as a racialized term only historically arises with the rhetorical motivations to spread Christendom. So I recognize that not all present-day Christians, by faith, want to be included in such a categorization. Thus, following my friend and mentor, Tink Tinker, who's a Wasatch Osage scholar, I emphasize that what I'm speaking about when I use the term Euro-Christian is a social movement and not a religion. In other lectures, I might talk about how the notion of religion and religious discourse changes from the years 1500 into the 21st century, but I'm not going to go into that today. What we need right now is just to have some historical perspective. So for Euro-Christians, domination was a legal process that baptized and converted land into property and humans into their respective places on a gradated yet hierarchical scale of Christianness versus, quote, natural rights that inherently included the capacity for rational thought. So sometimes you might hear that there were debates in the 1500s after the so-called discovery of the New World among Euro-Christians as to whether or not indigenous peoples were fully human. That's what is going on contextually in this discourse about rationality and natural rights. Important for today's lecture is just the idea that the idea of domination for Euro-Christians was always a good thing. We might think in 21st century terms that, oh, dominate. Some people who want to dominate other people, they're jerks, right? So we have a very negative or pejorative notion of the term domination. But for the Euro-Christians, that it was a good thing. Domination was the civilizing process itself. They saw, just as current-day defenders of Western civilization do, the arrival and spread of Christendom as the civilizing force necessary for the political and economic reshaping of the world. The economic reshaping of the world, colonial extraction, was for the remaking over of the world itself into a more godly state, the basileia tau theo, to speak in biblical terms, or the kingdom of God, which is what Christendom, that dom at the end of Christendom, is the same cognate for the Latin dominate, or domination. And so it's always hierarchical, it's always up-down, and it remakes over the world into the image of God for Christians to live in and to spread the word of Christ. And that's what happens in the notion of property. For example, when Columbus or colonizers come in, the first thing they do is they plant a sword, which is kind of a vision of the cross, into the land, and they rename an island, like Columbus named San Salvador, right? In the name of the Savior, right? That process is what the Euro-Christian social formation does to convert the land into property. It's a baptism of the land. It's a religious and political process. Once they encounter actual human beings, the first things that they want to do is rename them, give them Christian names, baptize them, and convert them as well. That's what the Euro-Christian impulse did as it encountered non-Christians in the so-called New World. Current day white supremacists who are Euro-Christians continue to employ the vague rhetoric of defending threats to Western civilization through post-race statements by saying that race doesn't exist anymore. Science tells us that race doesn't exist. Therefore, we are in a post-race society. Other ways that term post-race gets used is that, well, since the United States as a political entity elected Barack Obama, African-American president, it shows that our society is less racist in the past, and therefore we have overcome the problems, the social ills that necessitated the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, right? So that's another way that the term post-racism gets used. White supremacists in current day speak embrace the broader term Western civilization so that they can sidestep the whole question of race and racism to begin with, by just saying, no, what we embrace and what we celebrate is Western civilization, and it's these people of color, for example, who are narcissistic and drawing attention only to themselves and whining that can't embrace the positive things that the attributes that Western civilization has brought to people with its civilizing and civilizational tendencies. So this is partly why so many white folks today often see that current discourse on race is really about something that is being taken away from them by being more inclusive and being and equitable to, quote, people of color, for example. Some white people think that something is being intrinsically taken away from them, or they can't celebrate their holidays anymore, or now Christianity is under attack. That type of thinking is all part of this enraptured, enmeshed rhetoric around and defending Western civilization. Now, writers like Robin DiAngelo, for example, in a famous book like White Fragility, term this as this whole feeling as part of the matrix of what she calls white fragility, and the need, therefore, to historically to recognize the historical nature, rather, of this thing called white privilege. Progressivist rhetoric, and I would include Robin DiAngelo in this category. Progressivist rhetoric in current U.S. culture wants to take action by constellating a comportment and a set of behaviors that addresses persistent racial inequity, for example, by embracing, quote, uncomfortable conversations and the acknowledgement of the benefits of white privilege. Non-progressive rhetoric, at the same time, wants to say, we've already done this. Race doesn't exist anymore. We're in a post-race society. And according to biological science, race doesn't even exist. So whenever we talk about race, we're just perpetuating this biologically non-existent thing. When are we going to get over our discussions of race? That's what the sentiment that comes from the non-progressivist discourse, right? Or the people who say, I don't see race. I treat everybody equally, for example. So one right-wing podcast I recently listened to, for example, sets itself up as providing tools for critical thinking, and locates the phrase, this guy was warning, whenever you see or hear the term historically marginalized people, that's code. That's this left-wing code for reparations. It's fallacious, though, according to this podcaster's definition, because if the people were historically marginalized, they no longer are historically marginalized, because everybody's equal now, right? So that sets this kind of reset button that says that because we're all equal now, the only people that could be wanting something like reparations are people who are somehow gaming the system, who are whining and they just want to be treated specially. That's what the current conservative rhetoric uses to address the situation around racism. So therefore, according to this podcaster's logic, for example, or the conservative logic, people seeking to address historical inequity are simply whiners looking for a handout. Arlie Hochschild, who's a sociologist, has written about this in a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, and she has talked about like the frustrations and the anger that we often see in rural and poor white communities, where American citizens see their notion of the American dream in this kind of linear notion of progress. So what's important here is that whether you're a progressive liberal or a conservative, both of those identity categories are going to see history on this longer, linear, progressive scale. So both the civilization, Western civilization defenders, and the more progressivist people who say that it's 2021 and we need to have gotten better in terms of our race relations, both want to see this kind of linear trajectory in terms of how we deal with discourse. In Strangers in Their Own Land, Arlie Hochschild explains that through interviews with white folks, especially in rural America, that they consider the idea of the achievement of the so-called American dream as being within their grasp, but they conceive it as kind of a line of people at the store, right? And other minorities, other immigrants, recent immigrants to the country, for example, they simply need to get to the back of the line in this type of thinking. No cuts, no buts. So I need to receive my due before we give some whiny person who's complaining about the way that they're discriminated against in terms of race. I need to get my due, and they will get their due eventually. I'm not being discriminating against them. I'm just saying that I get my due, and I should get my due because my family has lived here for X amount of years or whatever. Now, of course, this forgets the fact that EuroChristians are invaders and participated in the genocide of indigenous peoples who lived here to begin with, right? Such are the contradictions of this kind of discourse. But I think what Arlie Hochschild and scholars like her are able to effectively do is at least explain how some white folks perceive affectively or emotionally what is going on in the ways that they're being persecuted, right, by this new discourse on race. So at stake here is what affect theorists who study emotions, for example, such as Lauren Berlant has termed the anatomy of national fantasy. So Berlant writes, quote, "There's no one logic to a national form, but rather simultaneously the literal and the metaphorical meanings, the stated and the unstated." So we as people, when we think about nationalist identity, we expand our individual identities into various socialized constructions, race being one of them, but we could also talk about gender, ethnicity, nationality, religiosity, age, ability, disability, all of the categories that are so frequently invoked by inclusive excellence rhetoric. In a rights-based civic culture underwritten by liberalism, we look to governing institutions to recognize and protect our rights. Yet an inherent contradiction is forced upon the conditions of existence for historically marginalized peoples. The term identity politics, for example, which often gets used so glibly, like that's just identity politics. Identity politics, which is often historically traced to the Black feminist Combahee River Collective in 1977, developed from the sensibility that the conditions conventionally describing mainstream political or qualified life, as opposed to bare life, even in feminist and civil rights rhetoric, did not adequately speak to the existential conditions of the Black feminists or the Black women who were members of the collective. And so they framed their own agenda as being a kind of identity politics, and then that term gets like expanded from there. But I think that what gets sort of lost when we just throw out the term identity politics without thinking too much about it, is that they were speaking to existential conditions that they had as Black women and as feminists, and sometimes as lesbians, for example, that weren't included in the broader civil rights discourse. So it's become way too easy, in my personal opinion, it's been way too easy in current speak to simply refer to a category such as identity politics and think that we know what it means, especially since so much activism looks to existing governing structures to reform a notion of national identity that was built on white or Euro-Christian supremacy. So, for example, recent initiatives such as the 1619 Project seek to reframe our sense of national values, as in the United States, for example. The project seeks to reframe our national values upon the desire for freedom cultivated in those whose forced labor did the actual building of so much of the initial infrastructure of the United States, that, or at least the infrastructure that would later become the United States, right? So if we're talking about 1619, it's quite a more than almost almost 2 centuries before the entity of the United States. In such thinking, we might then follow the activist Ruby Sales, who see that the legacy of the first runaway slaves, of the Maroons, for example, as the early freedom fighters who started a movement towards freedom that we have yet to realize. You don't have to only be an African American person to see that the first so-called runaway slaves were seeking their own freedom. And so if we had that as our deal of freedom, even those of us who are not African Americans could say, like, yeah, I don't want slavery to exist. I don't want racism to exist. There's an enduring idea of freedom that was started by these so-called runaway slaves who were actually the heroes and the initiators of a movement towards freedom, away from oppression, away from slavery, that we could embrace. And of course, slaves had that kind of desire for freedom too, and eventually it was granted to them, but it's been a long haul. And we can get in on that version, a notion of freedom, and embrace it as the true idea of what American values of freedom might be, right? That's the thinking that comes out of, I think, partly the 1619 Project, and also Ruby Sales, who's an older activist who was an activist alongside Martin Luther King in the 1960s, for example. So in this sense, again, the value of freedom and democracy is a movement that precedes the entity that we now know as the United States and has yet to be realized. Such thinking is deeply tied to Black spirituality in the United States, which, even in overtly Christian language, is not necessarily Euro-Christian in the way that I've been using that term Euro-Christian here, but that has at times, through hybridized forms, the fact that African American people have embraced to a certain extent this entity called Christianity, in hybridized forms, has had to exist within the overarching impulses of domination inherent to Euro-Christian colonialism. And so we might see the black church, as it's rhetorically referred to in the United States today, as existing within the broader umbrella of capital C Christianity throughout time. But what I'm saying is that actually there are impulses within the black church and black spirituality that contrast that earlier notion of Euro-Christian colonialism that produced the racial categories in modernity that continue to plague us in social life. So we can see that what's at stake more clearly here, if we again look back to the black intellectual thought of the late 20th century, so well before our current discourse on Black Lives Matter, for example. And particularly thinkers such as Cedric Robinson and his claims in his magnificent History of Slavery, which he calls Black Marxism. Now, don't be fooled by the title of Cedric Robinson's book alone. In line with the black intellectual tradition that I've been foregrounding here, Cedric Robinson saw impulses arising out of the enslavement of black people that historically preceded Karl Marx's notion of communism or Karl Marx's thought in general. What Robinson wants to say, though, is that those impulses which existed among black people to begin with and were part of social formations on the continent of Africa have been obscured or made opaque by the broader white supremacy that has driven national history or nationalist narratives in the United States of history. Now, that term opaque or opacity is a term that comes from the African American scholar Charles Long in his book Significations. And that is, I think, a really powerful way of conceiving what we might otherwise call black hybridity. Now, we would want to call like black church or the black spirituality just syncretic, right? Which says that it's simultaneously African and Christian, for example. Because that notion of syncretism that just says blends everything together ignores that there's an asymmetrical historical influence of Christian colonialism that endures, and it endures in white supremacy today, for example, even amid the fact that there are many African American people, Native American people who might call themselves Christians today. And might want to might not embrace those more overt notions of white supremacy. So when we look at this historically, the introduction of slavery to the English colonies, for example, was enmeshed in its claims to emergent white or Euro-Christian supremacy over Catholic Spain, who, as the famous Black Legend, it was called in the 1500s. The idea was that English or Anglo-Euro-Christians were more capable than those of Catholic Spain to governance in the colonies. This was attributed by the English, who had miraculously defeated the Spanish Armada in the 1580s. And the idea here that the rationale that the English people came up with was that due to the too much Spanish mixing, I'll put that in quotes, with Moors or Saracens or Muslims, right? Before the Reconquista in the early 1490s, a century before the defeat of the Armada almost, that due to that intermixing, Spanish people became more inferior and less capable of governing correctly. But the purer white Anglo-Saxons kept this inherent ability to rule and to govern. So the Black Legend was a way of looking at Spain and saying that Spain and its colonial presence didn't do as an effective job of governing as the white colonizers did. So Anglo-Saxon blood, in this sense, would prove its inherent ability to govern and colonize by drawing on its domination of Ireland, as Theodore Allen has laboriously tracked in that great 2-volume series, The Invention of the White Race. The rapid importation of African slaves in the Virginia colony in the late 16 teens, where the 1619 project comes from, right? The radical importation of African slaves economically derived from a drastic drop in the price of tobacco and the need for forced labor in an area where indigenous people had been genocidally wiped out, and poor Euro-Christians could no longer seek reimbursement either by money for the bundles of tobacco or for land grants that were promised through indenture, that if you come over to the colony as a laborer, as a white laborer, you might eventually be able to work your way out of your indenturedness, and that you would then be granted a certain amount of land, and then you could build your own freedom out of your indenture. Because there was a crash in the economic marketability of tobacco and tobacco crops, there was a drastic need for labor and cheap labor, and that could not be filled by white folks as easily as it could be filled by black people who were forced to work with no pay and with no guarantee, or that eventually they could work their way out of their slavery and then become landowners themselves. So, as Cedric Robinson has detailed, the idea of European civilization has long been premised on the idea of enslavement. Slavery is a social formation of inequity that existed since ancient times, yet its modern form, however, emerged as a secularized value promoted by the ideological narratives of the rise of the middle class. Run-of-the-mill social progressivists really ought to take note here. So this is the long quote I will give from Cedric Robinson. The bourgeoisie, says Robinson, that led to the development of capitalism were drawn from particular ethnic groups, the European proletariats and mercenaries of the leading states from others, its peasants from still other cultures, and its slaves from entirely different worlds. The tendency of European civilization through capitalism was thus not to homogenize, but to differentiate, to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones. As the Slavs, which is where we get the term slave from to begin with, right? As the Slavs become the natural slaves, the racially inferior stock for domination and exploitation during the Middle Ages, as the Tartars came to occupy a similar position in the Italian cities of the Middle Ages, so at the systemic interlocking of capitalism in the late 16th century, the late 1500s, the peoples of the Third World began to fill this expanded category of a civilization reproduced by capitalism. Now, one of the benefits here in the coating of these darker toned skin bearers as somehow being racially inferior and therefore necessary to occupying the role of forced labor for civilization, was that you didn't have what you had in the early, like in the 1215 law that I cited earlier, where Jewish people and Muslims had to dress differently, right? The reason why those laws existed was because people who were Jewish were intermixing and intermarrying with Christians, and people could not tell visibly the difference between other folks. But once that notion of moral hermeneutics between white, light, and dark becomes mapped onto physiognomic difference or skin color difference, then people could more easily determined who was a slave and who was therefore naturally inferior to the whites. So the mechanism of othering in order to produce this notion of civilization expanded rapidly during the 15th and 16th centuries as Africans and indigenous peoples of the so-called New World came to occupy the forced labor necessary to sustain civilization itself. The so-called discovery of the New World certainly shifted the earlier Euro-Christian worldview because it encountered something previously inconceivable. But as with any new phenomenon, the brains, their brains, the EuroChristians' brains, categorized according to existing cognitive schemas and worldviews available to them, which were entirely Euro-Christian. So there was, if I were to draw on the rhetoric, or not even the rhetoric, but the science of cognitive theory, as we know it in the 21st century, we know that our brains categorize when we encounter something new that we haven't seen before. Our brains put that into the closest fit of a category that we might have to begin with. So Euro-Christianity had already framed the world as existing since Genesis in the Bible, right? And so what do they do when they encounter people of the Americas, before it's called the Americas, of the Western continents, from a European perspective? They're west of Europe, right? Well, the Euro-Christians say, well, how did these people get here? Are they humans, or were they a race of people that were made by the devil to confuse us, right? Because if we're following the tradition since Genesis in the Bible, which goes back X amount of years to the Garden of Eden in the Middle East, all of this sort of stuff, how do these people come to occupy these different continents? Well, maybe they were just a race of people created by the devil himself in order to confuse us. Or later on, maybe they were the lost tribe of Israel, as the Mormons tended to see Native Americans, for example. Even so, that categorization, well, the people got here because they had to somehow be reconciled with the notion of world history derived from the traditions of the books of the Bible, right? So our brains tend to categorize and create a taxonomy. The Euro-Christians had already been developing this notion of world history, and then they start plugging the new peoples into this gradated form of a scale of civilization that they themselves have invented. So modern racism, by this standard, if we're going to turn to not modern racism, is merely a transformation of earlier forms of subjugation employed by the dominant social groups to maintain power. The emergence of two entirely abstract terms, the Negro and the Indian, for example, remain important for understanding how modern racism attempts not only to make an other to then justify its own civilizational process, but also to erase people as well. So as Robinson details in his book, the racial mist, as he calls it, of European civilization had settled over the topography of English colonies by the 18th century, by the 1700s. In large part after the initial decimation of the native populations of what we call the Americas, right? The transatlantic slave trade slowly brought a more enduring and domestic enemy to the colonies. This was part of the rhetorical erasure of various African peoples, as well as the rhetorical erasure of indigenous peoples. As Robinson writes, quote, "For many reasons, however, it's fair to say that the most significant of the obliterations of the New World's past was that which affected the African. The African became the more enduring domestic enemy, and consequently the object around which a more specific, particular, and exclusive conception of humanity was molded." The quote Negro, that is, the color black, was both then a negation of African and a unity of opposition to white. The construct of Negro, unlike the terms African or Moor or Ethiop, suggested that no situatedness in time, that is, history or space, that is, ethno or politico-geography. The Negro had no civilization, no culture, no religions, no history, no place, and finally, no humanity that might command consideration, like his Eastern, Central, and Western European prototypes, the Slavs, for example. In their time, and the French peasants, the Slavs, the Celtic people, and more recently the American Indians, the Negro constituted a marginally human group, a collection of things of convenience for use and or eradication. This, of course, was no idle exercise in racial and moral schemata, since it directly related to a most sizable quantum of labor disciplined and applied in the most extraordinary way. Slave labor in the New World, as we have seen it in the pre-capitalist societies of Europe, was an inextricable element in the material, commercial, and development that took place. Now, so Robinson isn't claiming that black people were more oppressed, for example, than indigenous peoples of the Americas. What he is saying is that the category of Negro was decultured and abstracted to begin with, in a way that Negro people or black people could become the domestic enemy of the United States. So you could still have this in terms of Indian people, like a hostile Indian, which is a category, as opposed to the Indians that assimilate. But white supremacy has had this tradition of exalting the Indian by saying that, like, oh, they've been genocided, but they were a noble race, for example. And the more savage the Indians were, the more brave the white supremacists were, the Anglo-Saxons were, in their ability to defeat or assimilate them into their own blood. Whereas the black African who gets racialized according to skin color becomes an enduring abstraction that has no history of its own, that becomes then the public enemy number one, to quote Chuck D, for example, right? So Robinson is not playing the oppression Olympics, right, by competing between different racialized groups. Rather, Robinson's broader argument is a correction to the European narratives of radical or revolutionary thought embraced by conventionally leftist or Marxist traditions. Instead, Robinson situates black radicalism in the African traditions erased by the invention of the Negro, thus articulating that such an intellectual tradition received and advanced upon Marxism according to its own terms. Much like earlier articulations in the 20th century of negritude, for example, by Robinson's predecessors such as Aimé Césaire or Frantz Fanon, the tradition that Robinson details is not bound to a particular region or nation state, and so it is different than some of the popular domestically driven rhetoric of current racial political agendas such as Black Lives Matter, especially those embraced by the mainstream liberal progressives and the rhetoric of inclusive excellence in our state-run public education in the United States. So if we're going to bring this into contemporary times, perhaps a more accurate descendant of Robinson's thinking and his conclusions maybe appears in the more radical media projects such as the Black Agenda Report, which has no love for surface-level politics of inclusion that mistake tokenism for actual institutional or ideological change. Being aware of this, and when I point to something like the Black Agenda Report as having a different agenda than, say, the inclusive excellence rhetoric that we see in public schools and institutions in the United States, allows us to be more aware of the nuances within Black intellectual traditions and helps us to avoid the trap of the white-black binary that dominates political discourse in the United States today by lumping people of color, which I use in quotes here, into one category and white people into another, all the while forgetting the fact that whiteness was a category produced by Euro-Christian colonization in order to distinguish a particular class who were heirs to the domination of land and indigenous peoples. The rhetorical erasure of indigenous peoples is maintained by a current discourse that employs acronyms such as BIPOC, for example, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. That is a discourse that seeks a reformed attention to who is included as rights-bearing, privileged, and democratic subjects, while never questioning the ethno-religious fabrications that give our current governing structures their right to rule. Simply including indigenous peoples in a term like BIPOC as a gradation of brownness further erases and genocides actual indigenous peoples by assimilating them into an agenda by which, say, African Americans, for example, might seek more central political representation from their previously historical marginalized status. Indigenous people, on the other hand, want their respective sovereignty to be recognized. They have had their citizenship since 1924 and the Citizenship Act foisted onto them by the American government. They do not necessarily want to all be recognized as American citizens with these rights. Even the Indian Civil Rights Act of the late 60s, for example, what you see over and over again with indigenous peoples is forced assimilation being imposed onto them. Whereas African American rights-based traditions and the broader civil rights movement of the 1960s, for example, wants to completely see more and more inclusion into broader United States society. And so for this reason, in the late 1960s, the American Indian movement and the civil rights movements were not always on the same page. As Vine Deloria, for example, says in Custer Died for Your Sins or in God is Red, he says that against the MLK or Martin Luther King tradition, the American Indian movement had to distance itself and say, we don't want inclusion. We want to exist as separate sovereign nations that the treaties say that we are, but the treaties keep getting eroded or unrecognized by this idea of the United States that treats us as domestic dependents in law, for example. So what I'm getting at here is that when we only use a kind of white-black binary in terms of racial politics in the United States, or we say that there's white people and then black or the people of color, for example, that binary erases the fact that there are lots of different agendas within different groups. Among African Americans, for example, there is, or among Black intellectuals, more broadly speaking, I should say, there are the folks who follow, say, the Black Agenda Report and maybe align themselves with the earlier anti-colonial tradition that produces the negritude movement from which Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire come out of, and then the movements to try and get recognition and more access to democratic processes that come in the civil rights movements in the United States. They all share the Euro-Christian colonialism as the oppressive force, right? You know, whether you're Native American or African American, or you identify as Black but not African American, for example, or Latinx, for example, is being racialized by white supremacy in the United States. But the agendas are different. So a shared common oppressor is not the same thing as lumping all of the different groups into one broad group that we might just call people of color. So one of the fundamental differences in the oppression of Black and Indian peoples living on Turtle Island, for example, is a differing relationship to land. Black people were kidnapped and transported into fundamentally transformed ontologies. Christina Sharp, for example, has articulated this through the metaphor of being in the wake of slavery, in the profound depth of an oceanic and decontextualized existence left behind by the slave ship. Like Robinson and Jamaican writer Sylvia Wynter, Christina Sharp articulates a defiant position outside of the Euro-Christian construction of the human. She says, quote, "I'm not interested in rescuing Black beings for the category of human, misunderstood as capital M man, or for the languages of development, like civilizational development. Rather, both of those languages and the material conditions that they reproduce, continue to produce, are fast and slow deaths. I am interested in ways of seeing and imagining responses to the terror visited on Black life and the ways we, Black people, inhabit it, are inhabited by it, and refuse it. I'm interested in the ways we live in and despite that terror. By considering that relationship between imagining and imagining in the registers of Black annotation and Black redaction, I, Christina Sharp, still want to think about the ways these images, what these images call forth, and I want to think through what they call on us to do, think, and feel in the wake of slavery, which is to say, in an ongoing present subjection and resistance. Well into the 20th century, then, Euro-Christians referred to the Anglo-Saxon race as both the inheritor of Roman Christian imperialism and the survivor of a fight against Catholic or Norman yoke. Again, that's where that Black legend came from, right? The conception of whiteness in the United States is indeed constructive, affective, and aesthetic, and it precedes the founding of the Union and its pretensions to legitimacy. A culturalist conception blends the nostalgia for pre-modern race of the nation with a modern racism based on skin tone. Such a conception is persistently evident among white nationalists who effectively present their patriotic American identity through an intergenerational framing that is underwritten by a Euro-Christian worldview. So, for example, this Native American scholar Robert A. Williams, in a book called The American Indian and Western Legal Thought, says that, quote, "In constructing their discourse of resistance to British power in America, radical colonists appropriated themes and concepts from an eclectic array of sources. The Enlightenment-era discourses of natural law and rights, the British Constitution, the mythology of a purer Anglo-Saxon-inspired legal and political order in the New World, freed from the yoke of Norman-derived feudal tyranny, and especially the common sense view of property as acquired by labor and governments as established to protect property found in the texts of John Locke. These are the most frequently rated discursive formations, according to Williams." Colonists in New England manifested this fantasy through notions of race, whereby they were the true Saxons who had pioneered England, which under Norman and papal control had grown weak. They did not, however, see themselves as anti-Christian in any sense, even in their rejection of the Norman yoke or in embracing deistic critiques. So someone like Thomas Jefferson, for example, right? Even in embracing deistic critiques of increasing fractions and increasingly emergent Christian dominations, so increasing factions, sorry. Anglicism or Anglicanism, for example, simply remained too papal for the early American so-called founding fathers, right? The Anglicans were too papal according to the Puritans, for example, because in their papalism, in England's papalism, and its adherence to Norman yoke, the American colonists who had radically broken from that were able to occupy this more pure sense of Anglo-Saxonism that they had inherited from an unbroken tradition in their minds from before the French invasion of England in 1066, for example. The idea of their national fantasy was that they were the true, purer race of Anglo-Saxons who inherently had the better sensibility and right to rule, from which they developed the Articles of Confederation, and then the U.S. Constitution, and the Federalist Papers, and all of that sort of stuff that embeds the early foundation of the Republic within white supremacy. So, the so-called founding fathers of the United States did not see any contradiction between their newly formed republic and their aspirations to Euro-Christian empire. Rather, abstract notions of freedom became aligned with the performance of a true Anglo-Saxonism that can embody both its Viking savagery and its embrace of Christianity to correct the Roman Empire's decline as a world power. Contemporary Euro-Christians, then, often want to leave the past in the past, which simply minimizes the persistent returns on the investment in white privilege, while also rhetorically situating living American Indians, for example, into a distant past, and continuing to situate, in Cedric Robinson's terms, black people as public enemy number one, right? Others appeal to a mythological notion of the founding violence of the Republic to present themselves as willing beneficiaries to such a violence. In either case, such a thinking obscures the transgenerational inheritance of a Euro-Christian worldview while maintaining an entirely Euro-Christian worldview. So what I mean by this is that some, on the liberal side, we might say, some people want, I think that ethno-nationalists, white nationalists, white supremacists fully want to embrace the idea of Western civilization and the things that they benefit from it, because they see that their white supremacy is being under attack by people who want to reframe the ways that we think about nationality and nationhood, something like the 1619 Project, who wants to inherently reframe or which wants to inherently reframe the idea of American history from the freedom-seeking of the enslaved people, right? And to claim that that version of freedom is what we should be after as American citizens, whether we are of Anglo descent or African descent, that we should be our notions of freedom. The white supremacist view says, no, we want to hang on to this broader, older notion of civilization. We want to extract any kind of racialized language from that because it's like bad politics after Nazi Germany, for example, to be overtly racist and to say that race doesn't matter anymore, that we live in this post-race society, but we need to maintain our values of the democratic and historical political institutions that are part of this broader notion of white civilization. And so we see this continuing today in this discourse that posits tensions between those who are defenders of Western civilization and those who are seeking more attention to racial diversity, equity, and inclusion as a corrective to the inherent white supremacy that exists in rhetoric defending Western civilization. And then we get different authors such as Homer, attention to the Greeks and curriculum, Shakespeare, the so-called white male authors that have been traditionally part of the ways that we habilitate or habituate people in broader educational discourse in the United States along these racialized terms. I'm not going to be able to solve it all today, but hopefully this lecture has allowed us to see what is at stake in a much broader sense than what we normally take as conventional speak around something like Black Lives Matter, which is a very recent phenomenon. I've taken us back into the mid to late 20th century. I've looked at people like Frank Snowden, who said that modern racism exists only since the 1500s. And then you have these people like Dsouza, who want to say like that they're against critical race theory because critical race theory sees racism as existing throughout time, but Frank Snowden said that it only has existed historically since the 1500s, and therefore it can be overcome. The more where I tend to land is this idea that we can't take modern forms of racism and map them back onto antiquity, because they're modern forms of racism. But what we should rather see, and what the critical race theory really, I think, helps to get at, is that there are enduring forms of oppression that transform according to the ideologies of whoever ends up being in the dominant class at a particular time. And so what we get is skin-based racism emerging in that period from the 1500s to the present, because there was a certain class of people that wanted to situate themselves as being in power. That's where we get notions of whiteness to begin with in the historical record. So it isn't to say that Frank Snowden is wrong in his books, or that the critical race theorists are wrong, or that they're somehow incompatible with each other. Is that what we need to see is that the legacies of oppression and domination transform with whoever comes into power, and we need to attend to those forms of oppression and othering that might exist even in antiquity when we look at something like Homer in a different light then we might look at modern forms of race-based or skin tone physiognomy, and the kinds of racial oppression that exist in the past 500 years. So we want to look at continuity and transformation of the tendency to dominate, rather than the kind of purely historicist claim that says that skin-based racism, because it arises historically in the 15th century, in the late medieval, early modern time, and explodes into this biological notion of race in the modern era, that because it's historically based, we can simply uncover it. Well, certainly we can see that it's constructed socially, right? But it's constructed socially, and it continues to be constructed socially by the people who want to dominate other people and benefit for themselves and situate themselves as being in power. Thank you for listening, and we will catch up with you in more lectures on this. I know it's been heady and long, so thank you for staying with me. I will return now, if you're in the Homer and the Critique of Western Civilization class, back to readings of Homer with all of this stuff floating around in my close reading of Homer. Thanks for your attention. Hope you have a great day or night wherever you are.